All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our second video looking at some of the past exam questions for Unit 3 at the moment, because there's already Unit 4 ones available if you want to look at those. I'm really disappointed in myself. I actually told a mate that I was going to start this video with sup nerds, just to insult you all, but I missed out on my chance, so you win this round, Nick. What we're going to do today, start looking at Area Study 2. Area Study 2 is massive because it's like looking at macroeconomics, aggregate demand, business cycle, 5-flow circular flow model, and then the 3 domestic macroeconomic goals. So we kind of break it into the first part, and then a second part, which is going to mainly be like unemployment type stuff. And then we'll do another one about Australia and the world economy and the absolute nightmare that area study is for a lot of people. But we'll get straight into it with, I think I've got some tips here. I can't remember, I wrote this morning and I've already forgotten, because that is being an adult in 2020. So some key tips. The aggregate demand equation it's amazing. Like you love this equation. It's there to help you. It helps you answer all of your questions from now until almost the end of the year. Aggregate supply is its own little thing, but all the way up until the end of monetary policy. This helps you answer every question possible. So your AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. No matter what question you're given, when you're responding in regards to aggregate demand or any of the 3 goals, you need to refer to at least one of these components of aggregate demand, how it's impacted, and how it impacts on aggregate demand. And then if you're doing an economic goal question, how it impacts on that goal. And by doing that, it gives you a step-by-step that always means you're going to have the right answer as long as your logic is correct. So most of the time, you just go straight with how something affects private consumption spending, because that's the largest component of aggregate demand. You can directly link an increase or a decrease in that with an effect on aggregate demand, and then an overall impact on whatever economic goal. Interest rates are usually going to go for the effect on private investment spending, government projects for government spending, so infrastructure spending is a big one, defense spending. You can clearly tie that into increasing G, which is injection, which leads to more aggregate demand, more of whatever goal. Excellent. Exports, you're going to get looking at exchange rate, etc. And like the growth rate of our trading partners, all those kind of things. So it gives you an easy structure to all of your answers, and we'll look at that in some of the questions that we look at. But hopefully, if you've been in my class, I've been saying it all year long, and so you should hopefully get it by now. You should try and define the economic goals whenever that goal is mentioned in a question, including the target measurement. I've noticed in some VCAR's answers they don't have it all the time now, but then sometimes they do. I always err on the side of caution and say that you should do it. All the time you can shorten the definition and make it simple enough for you. I feel like it just gives quality to your answer regardless if it's asking about the goal. So to get into some multiple choice questions, today I've mixed it up by just screen capping them so I don't have to type them the whole time, which made a lot more sense. Past me as an idiot. Let's have a look at these. So first up, refer to the following aggregate demand, aggregate supply side diagram. This you may see in 2 different ways. Sometimes you might see the aggregate supply curves like this, without that weird squiggle at the end because I hit my keyboard. Sometimes they might look like that. Sometimes they might look like straight lines. I prefer the curved lines, but that doesn't matter for this question, because all this question is asking about which of the following is likely to cause a shift in the aggregate supply curve from AS1 to AS2. So what's happened is it shifts to the left, and as we know from everything else, when something shifts to the left, that is unfavorable. So then we've got to go through all of these options and see which is unfavorable. So if there is a decrease in interest rates, that's great. That means business is going to have a lower cost of production. They're going to be more likely to invest and expand. That's going to increase aggregate supply. So that is favorable. That's going to increase aggregate supply. An increase in production costs, well, that's bad. It's going to decrease aggregate supply. So we're already starting to think that's the right answer, but we better check the rest, because VCAR are jerks. They might try and trick us up with a more correct answer. Unlikely in this case. But an increase in government spending, well, that's aggregate demand side. That's irrelevant to this, so we can rule that out. And then an increase in profitability of businesses. If businesses are more profitable, they're not going to slow things down. They're going to increase production. So that's going to lead to things being increased. So then we get to our correct answer, which is B, an increase in production costs. Excellent. We nailed it. Great job, team. So that's the right answer. And that's the logic of why. Then we get into another one. This question oddly was on 2 years exams in a row. They just kind of changed the table a little bit, but it was the exact same calculation. So hopefully they'll just keep doing the same one forever and it'll always be the same answer, but let's work out the logic behind it. So with reference to the data in the table, the annual rate of inflation for the year entered June 2018 is what? So we're carrying about a year. So we're comparing June 2018 with June 2017. And when we look at that with our calculating inflation equations, we got 121. So we do year 2 minus year 1. So 121 minus 110 over the first year. So 121 minus 110 over 110, so that gives us 11 over 110, which is going to equal 10%. I'm pretty impressed with that for just writing with a mouse, to be honest. So we've done the calculations, we've gotten the correct answer, C. There we go, all good. The issues that came up in this question is some people started to use all the numbers because they didn't know what they were doing, or they just got worried and started using different things. Some people did over 100 rather than over the year 2, which is another issue, which gave them 11%. So VCAR like to give options there that if people did the wrong calculations, their calculation would come to an answer that seemed correct. So making sure you know the equation and can work that out, that is really, really important. So if we were to re-emphasize that, in your equation, it's always going to be year 2 minus year 1 over year 1 times 100. I always forget the times 100 part because when I do it in my head, it does that step automatically. Hopefully it does it for you too. Let's go to the next question. Question 8, getting into our circular flow model. So according to the 5-sector circular flow model of the economy, a rise in the total value of injections relative to the total value of leakages is most likely to result in what? So we're already thinking here, if we have an increase in the overall value of injections, so what's going to cause more aggregate demand, and so relative to the value of leakages, so it's increased by comparison to the value of leakages. So we don't know leakages have fallen, it just means that injections have increased by more than leakages have increased or fallen. So we just know there are more injections than leakages now, or we've moved in that direction. So if injections are increasing, what can we say from that based on these answers? So A decrease in consumption and a decrease in levels of aggregate demand. Well, if injections have increased more, aggregate demand is not going to decrease. So we can rule that one out, that's not right. A decrease in total incomes and a rise in the unemployment rate, aggregate demand will be increasing, that's not right. Neither a decrease in consumption levels of aggregate demand and total incomes, nor a rise in the unemployment rate. Well, seeing as we don't know how much they've risen or fallen by, that's kind of okay so far, so that's technically correct. A decrease in consumption, levels of aggregate demand, total incomes, and a rise in the unemployment rate. Well, once again, aggregate demand is not going to fall in this case. So that means C is the most correct answer. It tricked a decent amount of people because it was just strange how it was worded. And a lot of people didn't get that, the relative to leakages part. But hopefully, by just ruling out all the incorrect answers, you're going to get to the right response. So hopefully that doesn't seem too bad for you there. And then the last multiple choice we're going to look at, a relatively simple one that trips people up a lot. Which of the following is components of aggregate demand is the most unstable? So private investment, private consumption, government investment, government consumption. A lot of people get this wrong because they jump straight to private consumption here. And they say, well, tax rates change, consumer confidence, etc. But that's not right because consumption spending is fairly stable over time. It does fluctuate a little bit, but because we have needs, we're always going to be spending a certain amount regardless of how the economy is. And so private consumption spending is actually one of the most stable components of aggregate demand. Whereas when we look at others like government investment and government consumption, you wouldn't really say it's unstable because it's planned for the most part, other than welfare spending, etc. The government plans what they're going to spend. So that's not moving unexpectedly because they're going to announce things and then it's going to change. So we can rule those out as well. Why it is private investment expenditure is because interest rates change and that affects investment a lot. And so when that changes, and that can change on a monthly basis, that's going to greatly change the amount that people are investing, businesses being willing to invest and expand. That's all based on interest rates. And so if tomorrow they announced that interest rates were going to increase, suddenly private investment spending would plummet. It's already pretty low because of the pandemic. So that is why that one is the case. To get onto our short answers then. So most of these are from 2019, 2018, and 2017. So this is, I believe it's 2C from 2019. Explain the likely effect of a business cycle expansion on the rate of economic growth and on the rate of inflation. It's a 4-mark question, 2 marks for describing the impact on the rate of economic growth, and 2 marks for the impact on the rate of inflation. Relatively simple. Most people are pretty all right with this, but we'll get into a sample that I wrote up this morning. So generally, in a business cycle expansion, the rate of economic growth will be increasing. So that's showing you know what that is going to do. This is due to increased levels of injections into the economy, as well as increased private consumption spending due to increased incomes and employment. Just a little bit extra to explain why that's the case, to give it a little bit of quality. This increases the overall aggregate demand and sends a signal to businesses to increase production, therefore increasing the rate of economic growth. So there's the first 2 marks there. So 2 marks there come from, one's from saying that first part, and then one's for the overall effect on economic growth. There's some good numbers. The rate of inflation refers to the percentage increase in prices over a period of time. If the expansion occurs at a rate faster than production can keep up, or there is little spare capacity, this could lead to demand inflation occurring as consumers bid up prices to attain limited stock, and this would then mean that the rate of inflation would increase. So 1 mark for the explanation, and then 1 mark for the effect on inflation overall. And so that's relatively simple, pretty much straight to the point, the effect of it, the overall impact. So hopefully that's not too bad. That's a fairly achievable exam question. Next up, we have, assume Australia experiences unfavorable movement in the terms of trade across a 2-year period. Explain how the scenario might affect Australia's domestic macroeconomic goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. So in terms of what VCAR had here, they wanted people to describe the terms of trade, describe what an unfavorable movement in the terms of trade would be, the impact on the economic growth goal, and an impact on living standards. And whenever you refer to living standards, you always should refer to material and non-material. Otherwise, you'll probably lose out marks there. And when it's only worth 1 mark, you'd probably lose 1 whole mark, which would suck. Coffee break. The terms of trade is a ratio of the export price index over the import price index. The unfavorable movement in the terms of trade could mean that the average price received for exports has fallen and/or the average price of imports has increased over a 2-year period. What's really important there, and one thing that's going to differentiate students, is that point about knowing that an unfavorable movement in the terms of trade could be either of those 2 things. If you don't mention both of them, you're probably going to lose a mark because you're not as good as the students who do. And that's one thing that they really look out for. It's one thing they like to put with terms of trade questions in multiple choice, really distinguishes between the people who know what they're talking about and the people who've kind of just thought about it one way. Lower export prices could also reflect a fall in world demand, and so the revenue from exports might fall. This decreases export injections into the circular flow and the level of income it can be disseminated into the economy. Therefore, dividends, wages, and tax receipts might all fall, resulting in less ability to increase spending. Therefore, with falling aggregate demand, the rate of production might also fall, meaning the government's goal of achieving strong and stable economic growth is jeopardized. The fall in real net disposable income may also mean that purchasing power could decrease. For example, mining companies might have to lay off workers and might have to cut dividends and shut down some projects, which can lead to material living standards being a little bit lower. This could also lead to an increase in unemployment and therefore a decrease in people's purchasing power, leading to lower material living standards, and increased job insecurity and stress levels, leading to non-material living standards decreasing as well. So that's really important at the end there for that last mark, mentioning both material and non-material. I would probably include a quick definition of the economic growth goal. So the goal of strong, stable economic growth is the highest rate of growth possible without running into unnecessarily environmental, external, or inflationary pressures. A rate of 3 to 3.5% GDP growth per year. But that's just me. I just wouldn't want to lose marks if for some reason they wanted it. All right, now we're going to get into a question that involves looking at a graph and deciding if inflation has been achieved. So referring to the graph above, assess the extent to which Australia has been able to achieve its goal of low inflation or price stability in 2016-2017. As we know, you only care about the last 2 years, so you care about 2018 to 2020. So we're going to update this question. So we're going to look at 2019-2020, and we're going to look at a recent graph for it. So for this question, what we're going to do is we're going to define the goal of low inflation, and we're going to explain whether or not the goal has been achieved with reference to the data. Referring to the data is so important. Any question that has data there, you need to refer to as much of it as you can to make yourself seem smarter than you really are. Because the examiners love it. It shows that you're actually looking at it and applying it. So you really should do that. So let's look at the sample. The goal of low inflation is for the general level of prices to be rising at a rate of 2 to 3% on average over time as measured by CPI. Over the past year, from Jan 2019, the inflation rate was at 1.3%, and the July quarter of 2020 was sitting at negative 0.3%. This shows that on average, the inflation rate has been sitting below the government goal, and therefore the government has not been able to achieve the goal of low inflation. Best thing out of this question for 3 marks is just straight to the point. The goal, how it's been going on average, hasn't been achieved. 1, 2, 3, bang, you're done. Carry on and get those marks fairly easily. I'd love them to have a question like this again. It's kind of likely that they will, because what they're kind of expecting is a lot of people see this 2.2% up here. They see this guy and they think about, well, in March, everyone was panic buying, inflation was going up, but being within the target range for 1 quarter, when we're measuring it over a period of time, we tend to say 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, over the medium term, being in that target range for 1 quarter is not on average over time. Therefore, it has not been achieved. So be careful of that. Don't fall into that trap. Next question, another relatively simple one. It's very, very hard to find economic growth, inflation, and full employment questions that don't tie in with budgetary and monetary policy. So a lot of them are fairly basic here. So if you're just like, why is he giving us such basic questions? These are really simple. That's because these are the only ones that really tie directly into that goal. And if you want to have more complex ones, you got to go look at the budgetary policy side of things, which is in another video, which you can go and watch at your leisure. It was a while ago. Maybe it's not as good. Probably is though. So for this one, describe how depreciation in the Australian dollar might affect the rate of inflation in Australia. 1 mark comes from describing a depreciation of the exchange rate. An example always helps. Whenever you can, throw in an example. It shows you're smart and you know what you're talking about. And then 1 mark for the impact on the rate of inflation. So with this, a depreciation of the Australian dollar is when the value of the Australian currency falls in comparison to trading partners. This could occur if there's a reduction in domestic interest rates, as this lowers the demand for the Australian dollar. If the Australian dollar depreciates, this makes Australian exports cheaper for our trading partners, which increases their demand, increasing injections to aggregate demand. If AD increases at a rate faster than aggregate supply can maintain, this could then cause shortages, and demand inflation could occur, increasing the inflation rate in Australia. If you didn't want to go with the shortages route, you could also say that if aggregate demand increases and there's not a lot of spare capacity, that can lead to inflation being caused, demand inflation, etc. But yeah, that's it. That's for this first half of looking at economic growth, business cycle, low inflation. I'm going to try and do another one of these, hopefully later this week, if not over the school holidays. Oh, that doesn't sound right. Maybe not. I probably will though, because I actually like doing this. That will hopefully help out with the next half of this topic, looking at full employment. There's a lot of different unemployment questions. A lot of times where the examiners would like to just throw in things like jobs and growth and expect you to talk about growth and employment or long-term unemployment, all those kind of things. So we'll try and get into that. On that, I hope this is helpful for you. If there's anything that's unclear, shoot me an email or anything. I'm more than happy to help out. On that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Except I won't, because this is a video and you're just seeing me talk about stuff. Goodbye.